Welcome to the Deep Chat.
And everything is a trade-off to me. And in fact, I was joking with someone the other day. They said, my role at home is this. I said, my role at home is basically that I can't turn off my engineer brain, and I'm always looking at the trade-offs, which can be read, if you're not an engineer, it can be read as being negative.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at something and say, well, here's what happens if this, and here's what happens if that. And you're equally looking at the good things and the bad things. But it can be interpreted as being negative when you actually acknowledge bad things that could happen. Do you find that with you?
I know what you're talking about culturally, that there's this sort of, not quite a taboo, but something of like, oh, don't bring up the bad stuff. I was never very good at that in corporate America. I was always the guy saying like, hey, this thing will not scale, or this does not work the way we say it does. I don't know. I learned a lot about tact during that process, so something came out of it.
That is 100% true. Tact is the best word. I think I need to adopt that with my wife a little better. I mean, she's great. She continually tolerates my looking at all the angles. And I said to her jokingly that I need to write a book, and that book should be Marrying an Engineer.
Yeah.
And what it's like, right? Understanding that mindset and that brain. It sounds like Linda does it pretty well too.
You'd have to ask her, but yeah, there's something there. That's a great title, if nothing else. Yeah, you ought to be able to get some sort of advance on that.
Or how about So You Married an Engineer? ...
For some purchases, they will have no involvement.
Yeah.
For other surprising things, for example, a stove, they may need months of planning.
Exactly. That's it. They may need months of planning, and that's exactly true. And my wife will say, well, did you do this? And I said, well, no. She said, well, it'll only take a few minutes. I said, no, it won't.
Yeah.
It'll take hours. I'm going to have to research exactly what we need. I have to measure it. I have to find out if it's going to work, because that hour I spend doing it will probably save hours in the long run.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it. Like, if you don't get the right thing, then you're going to end up returning it. And then you have to do that whole process again. And that's happened, many times when, if I don't get involved on certain things, right? That
Sure. Yep.
You order that thing and then it doesn't fit in the room, or it won't get through the door.
There's a wonderful bit of fortune cookie wisdom I picked up at some point. Why do we always have time to redo it, but never enough time to do it right the first time?
Bingo. That's the engineer, right? That's the engineer in me. That's probably the engineer in you. And
the older and the aging engineer.
Yeah.
The younger me wanted to be scrappier.
Well, we're still agile.
Sure. Yeah.
With thought, with a decent amount of forethought. You got to, at some point, you got to leap, but it's always a trade. I do have some surprise sort of topic that I want to help myself understand. It is October 23rd, 2020. So that puts us, 2 weeks before the election.
Mm-hmm.
And you know me, I think about this stuff, and I find it fascinating from a psychological perspective, but also a data perspective. And that's what I want insight into. I read something that said that in the last election, there was only one poll, which was Nate Silver's, I think 538, which was more accurate at predicting the winner of the election than the gambling sites. To contrast that, in this election, almost all the polls give Biden like a 92% chance of winning or something. The betting sites have it at more like 65% or 63%, I think it was. So they give Trump like a 1 in 3 chance of winning.
Mm-hmm.
And they give Biden a 2 in 3 chance of winning, roughly. I can't remember what Nate Silver's poll has. I believe the 538 has him winning, Biden winning this time, but last time he had Trump winning, and he was the only poll to say that. What are your thoughts on that, in terms of the contrast between the hive mind gambling, odds setting versus the modeling and polling of polls and the modeling of an election? Any thoughts there? And again, this is off the topic, so this is just random. I have not prepped you at all for this, so there could be no right answer here. Just your thoughts.
Yeah, they're both interesting methods of guessing.
That's a good way to put it, because they're still both guessing, right?
Their mechanisms are very different, right? We start from very different assumptions. For some reason, the machine learning world is coming up for me, which I know these references won't help a lot of people, but things like reinforcement learning versus like Bayesian networks. They're both under machine learning, but they're very different approaches, different types of mathematics you would apply. And the same thing's going on here. The modeling is trying to be a more formal thing, more scientific. Scientific meaning like procedural, start from assumptions, and follow rigorous statistical methods. You lose a few things in that. Number one is you can't measure everything accurately. So, if your lens doesn't even let you see the moon, you don't have much of a telescope. And most survey type people and all that have no idea about the precision of their instrumentation. So the models, you have to buy into the assumption about how they calculated it. This stuff is kind of complicated. It's not a simple, like, we're not a majority vote system. So you have to model out counties and this and that. And the more complexity you add in, you know how it is, Occam's razor. You tend to prefer a more simple model as the correct one, or at least more parsimonious. But you don't get that if you want to account for all of these, details that obviously matter. Then to like the market side, it's sort of interesting to me because it's more of a clean mechanism or set of assumptions. It assumes that you have people who can engage in rational betting. And if that's true, and if you have enough of them, then the market signal, so to speak, is what will reflect the best prediction you can get.
538.com predicts Trump wins 12 in 100 they did 40,000 simulations. Trump wins 12 in 100. Biden wins 87 in 100.
Wait, what happened in that other case?
Well, they go through it and they break it down. I couldn't tell you.
That's the one where Trump refuses to secede office?
Yes. That's actually all 12. That's how he wins. But aside from the humor, they took a lot of things into consideration. And this is the guy, 538, who predicted Trump winning last time. And now he's predicting Biden winning.
Well, that's not quite right. Nate Silver he predicted a Hillary win.
Oh, he did.
His was one of the only polls that wasn't absurdly skewed, like saying 99%.
Is that true? Okay, I did not know that.
I'd have to look it all back up to remember the exact details, but that's the moral of the story. And I'm not surprised. All those old polling techniques are garbage. They still rely on like robo-dialed phone numbers to landlines to take measurements. They've a complete and blatant refusal to modernize their mechanisms. Nate just did a little bit better than that. And it's not to say he got it right or wrong. You need to get, we don't see the counterfactual. All these models assume like, if you ran the election 20 times, well, that's never going to happen. We don't know.
And that's what I was going to get at is there's an article I read, and I'm going to try to bring it up so I can cite it better, that has, it's Helmut Norpoth. You ever heard of him?
I have not, no.
Helmut Norpoth predicts massive popular and electoral victories for Trump. First off, he correctly predicted 2016. The Norpoth, Norpoth, he's a professor of political science, forecasting elections based on his primary model, a statistical representation of the U.S. presidential races based on data going back more than a century. So apparently it says it correctly predicts 25 of the last 27 elections, given the data. And that one of the things that it does is it ignores all polling data because he believes it is totally and utterly inaccurate. And it doesn't account for the things that matter. So let me find this. He said, I focus on early primaries and the way the candidates perform in those early contests. It's a very good predictor and a leading indicator of what's going to happen in November. He described the focus on primaries as the key difference between his model and others. It's all about primary elections, which are real electoral contests, and the votes are counted and tabulated, he said. I also use real numbers, such as the results of previous elections, which indicate whether the pendulum is swinging away from or toward the White House party. This is something that also relies on real election results and not any kind of opinion poll. Unlike many other projections, Norpoth's equation ignores approval ratings. That's a poll number, he said, and I don't use those. I think the primary performance of a sitting president is usually a proxy for that, but I don't use any polling data or data related to opinions. I found this fascinating. Put your objective hat on. Forget the fact that he says it's a landslide win for Trump. What he says there resonated with me. We have not been able to believe the polls in a long time. So, and what you hinted at is that polls are not necessarily accurate as well because there's a lot of potential bias in it.
Yeah, I mean, I should maybe back a little bit on that. I did slam the pollsters. Broadly speaking, obviously they're individuals. We should go one by one, but broadly speaking, I think that's fair. But I also don't want to say, we should just take liberties with, oh, polls are terrible. They're never accurate. We can't trust them. It's the degree to which we trust them. We have high expectations of our weatherman or weatherwoman that we get our data from. Or I guess we don't have those anymore. We just go to some app now. But you know what I mean? The weather's very reliable. If I gave you a stock tip and you took it, you understand that there's a risk there. If it falls, I mean, maybe you'd be mad at me, but you know the context within which I'm giving you that. And we should look at polls in a similar way. But to this guy's thing, Helmut, it's interesting. It's very interesting because he definitely has a thing he's measuring that he can get a good measurement of that should correlate with the outcome. So let's talk about like his underlying assumption that there's a correlation between what happens in the primaries and the election. And like I just learned about this guy, so I don't know his methods. I'm making some guesses here, but some even basic guesses that I think are fair and give strength to his arguments. So
Here, I'll give you one thing real quick. Here's what he says. He says, people have forgotten how Joe Biden did in New Hampshire, said Norpoth. He was terrible. He got 8.4% of the vote, which is unbelievable for a candidate with any aspirations of being president. And then they say, so was there anything any of the Democrats could have done this year to get in better position, or was it Donald Trump's election to win or lose? He says, what the Democrats should have done if they were really serious about beating Trump would have been to rally around one candidate right from the start and not have a protracted battle in which people get wounded. They needed to pick one person and have everybody else take a pass. That's the only way I could see that my model would have worked in their favor. Again, so he's focusing on data, which election counts and votes are actual data. They're provable, right? People did this thing. It sounds like he's taking into account sentiment. Are people excited about the candidate? And citing New Hampshire as 8.4%, people weren't excited about Biden.
If I were to frame an election prediction broadly in the most generous mathematical sense, it's you have some number of indicators, no bigger than the population size, because that would just mean you directly measure everyone's vote, mapping to who won the election. So you need some function that maps from your inputs to that binary output. Now, obviously, we can't directly measure all the voters, so we don't have 350 million features. We have some smaller number that have to be a proxy for that ground truth measurement. So what's a good proxy? We could go on Twitter and measure the volume of tweets by different hashtags. And I know that sounds silly and ridiculous, but there is information content in there. And if you'd studied that, like the rise of before the primaries, during and after, like did this person rise quickly or did they always have an early lead? There's information there you could extract from Twitter. But Twitter is a noisy signal. It's like a radio with static in the background. Can you get a more precise measurement? This guy claims, so he starts from a very reasonable correlation that primary should correlate in some way with the actual outcome. Makes sense, right? If someone, you get huge turnout and you're the obvious winner for your party and all this kind of stuff, it's this growing star, that information exists mathematically in the primary data, or the converse of that too. How strong of a predictor is that? It's hard to say because just like Twitter is a noisy thing, the primary is too. I've never voted in a primary. And I think a lot of people would say the same thing. It's maybe for more party people or that kind of stuff, or I don't know. Everyone has a different motivation, but it's not the election. So it's measuring something and still making an inference. The question is his method more precise than something else? More precise than Twitter? Sure.
Yeah, because the noise is not as high. The
Yeah.
noise level is not as high as Twitter because you have actual data, but still there's an inference there.
It's a nice one, though, because it's pretty clean. Twitter, how obviously noisy that is, but still potentially valuable. This primary data is a small subset of basically the same problem.
So yeah, there's a reason he calls it the primary model. I just realized because it focuses on primaries. And what's nice about that is he can take it back for the last, however many elections, apparently 27 that we have data on. We have accessible data on the voting for every county in the nation, and he's run his model against that.
You've got to be cautious of that, though. That's a short timeline.
It is.
You know the fallacies about like market research stuff. Like a company spins up 50 mutual funds, they wait 5 years, most of them are doing, not that great. They pick out the three that are doing good and they try and sell you to those. Past history does not predict future
Right.
performance.
Right. And something else he says here that's interesting. He made a change to predict straight to the Electoral College. I've never done that before, but I made an adjustment because of the mismatch we had in
Aha.
2016, and I'm prepared to see Trump lose the popular vote again. So this prediction is entirely about electoral votes. It's important he made that distinction because telling us that the American people at large are going to vote Biden, but the Electoral College skews that, and it's going to be an even, what he's saying, a bigger gap between the Electoral College and the people than it was during Hillary Clinton's, because he's predicting Trump wins more electoral votes than he did last time, which I find fascinating. If you look at the news, it's basically Biden's going to win. Is that the general consensus?
I'm not the best person to ask, but I think you're right. Yeah.
If you start talking to people, which I've been doing, I just don't get that. It more aligns with what I'm reading in this guy's model.
Oh, I think Trump will win again.
You do?
I do,
Why do you
yeah.
think that?
I didn't think he would win last time. I know that sounds silly, but he did. There's always being a what do you call it, incumbent tends to have a little momentum for whatever reason, or historically, if we're going to go back as this guy does and look at past elections, being the incumbent works in your favor. I don't think Biden's a strong candidate. I'm not my personal point of view or anything, just saying I believe that's a broad perception. And I don't know. I think those who put Trump in office still support Trump.
It's a tough one for me because I'm caught in between two worlds here. Part of me thinks that the edge favors Biden only because of the negative publicity. Again, this is an opinion, or this is not what I believe internally, because I don't really talk about that. And when people say, "Do you have an opinion?" So I don't really have an opinion. I just have what I'm observing. So this is what I'm observing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know. By the way, I vote. I'm voting third party. I don't really like either one of them.
Oh, you voted for Kanye. Awesome. I told Linda to put Kanye for me
No.
too, but I don't know what she put.
No, my first female presidential candidate, Jo Jorgensen. I haven't voted yet, but in all likelihood, I'll check that box. So I'm kind of like a wounded observer at this point. And what I see is that the media has done a good job, along with the narrative that Biden has and team has pushed, that Trump is, racist, and he's responsible for the deaths of a lot of people. I think they've done a good job at that because that's an emotional pull, right? And emotions typically win elections.
I don't think people are going to buy that though.
Well, hold on. But there's the but, right?
Yeah.
The but is, I thought that was working for some time because there wasn't a lot of combativeness on that topic from the right. But I feel like they just waited, and now they want to swing it in the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And they've been doing a good job of that. I've started to really think about this, and I wanted to get your opinion. And I've talked to a number of people about this. Some people, can't see past their bias, in my opinion, when I say this stuff. And everybody will say, oh, Trump's a racist, and the people who vote for him are racist, or people who vote for Trump are only voting for their financial interest, or anybody who believes that he did a good job with COVID is wrong and they don't mind killing people. Like all these emotionally charged things that connect people on the right to this insensitivity, right? Just painting this broad picture of the right as loaded with racists and people who don't care about other people, which is not true. I think we can probably agree on that. You can't characterize a whole group that way.
Correct.
And the right has characterized the left as people who don't want to work, are socialist, and just want to be given everything, and that's the general characterization, right? Coming from the right. And both are disingenuous on both sides. I grew up, we grew up in suburbs outside of Chicago, so we had exposure to the city. My dad was a cop, and then I had uncles and aunts and entire families on my dad's side in Arkansas. We used to visit that a lot, so I had a lot of exposure there. And then I moved to LA at some point, and my mentor here, Ron Chappelle, he's got his PhD in education. He was grew up in South Central to a single mother. He's black. He became a cop, got his PhD, worked at the highest levels of the California police in general. He's been in witness protection. He's done everything. So I've gotten his insights. And so one of the things I see, I'm going to preface it with a story that might illustrate it, is my dad's brother, my uncle, who moved to Arkansas, got out of the city. So he knew the city life. And then he went to Arkansas, which, at the time, he probably was in the 60s, he went there. And they grew up in the 40s for the most part, 40s and 50s. He probably went to Arkansas in the early 60s, which at that time was undeniably probably racist. There's still a lot of that going on. It was the height of civil rights movements and things like that. He, at 72, to illustrate what the point is, at 72 years old, he was trimming a tree with a chainsaw up on a ladder on his big property in Arkansas. Nobody was around. He fell, shattered his ankle, army crawled himself back to his house, which is 50 yards away or more. Couldn't walk, so he army called his son, sat himself down in a chair, turned on the TV, calls his son, who is out on a lake, doesn't really have cell phone service, gets the message an hour later. It's like, well, my dad actually left a voicemail. He never leaves voicemail, so something might be up. So he calls him back on a particular spot on the lake where there's actually cell reception. And he said, yeah, I hurt myself. I said, all right, I'm coming over. So he goes over there, and he's sitting there watching TV with his foot sitting up, and he looks at his foot, and it's swollen as big as can be. And he says, all right, let's go to the hospital. And he says, nope, not going to the hospital. Well, why wouldn't you? Why? He says, well, it's Memorial Day. All the yahoos go to the hospital on Memorial Day. So he didn't want to be a yahoo.
I mean, who does? But
right.
Is that a thing? I'm not.
It's a thing for him.
All right.
He was a man of extremes. So he said, give me an aspirin. We'll go in the morning. So he takes an aspirin. And mind you, his ankle's shattered. He takes an aspirin, sleeps all night. He gets him in the morning, goes, how'd you sleep? He goes, fine. Why? Takes him to the hospital. And the doctor looks at his leg and goes, when did this happen? He's like, yesterday. He's like, it's shattered. You slept? Right? He's like, well, yeah, I had some aspirin. Okay, well, we got to take care of this. So they do, I think, surgery and patch him up. And of course he heals. And it's 2 years later when I hear this story, when he's walking around Busch Gardens or something. I can't remember what it was. And I said, hey, that must hurt because he's limping. And thanks for coming out and seeing us, because we're not in Arkansas much with my family. And he says, what the hell else am I going to do? Complain?
Uh-huh.
Right? So here is what I think the core difference is. And that story will come clear in a moment. When you grow up in an area where there's no police for miles, and where if you harm yourself in any way or harm someone else, the consequences are huge. You break your leg, and there's nobody around, and there's no cell phones, and there's none of that. There's nobody to pick you up, and there's nobody to help you. The moment you walk out your door in a lot of parts of the United States, it's your responsibility, period. And you're likely not going to get help. Now, as cell phones become more ubiquitous, that'll change. But even then,
it's only easing. It only gets you in touch with emergency services faster.
Right. And it may not work. You can't always rely on it.
Right.
And then there's the fact that there's no police to solve your problem.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, in Arkansas, problems were solved by getting in arguments and punching each other quite often. Now, Hank, my uncle, was 6'5", about 280 pounds. So, people didn't really argue with him that much, which is fortunate. And that's it's fortunate for him because he's the bigger, badder guy. That is also one of the problems with it. The biggest badass in those areas is going to win. The scariest person is going to win. But take the implications of what I've just talked about and stick that into a culture and say, how does that shape the cultural values and the culture at large of people who grow up that way? Not just Hank, but anybody who grows up that way in farmland where there's no cop, you're solving your problems. You stick your hand in the thresher, you're dead. Like you break an arm and it's a compound fracture and blood spurting out, you're probably dead.
Mm-hmm.
All these things of these examples of I have to solve my problems my way and I can't rely on anybody. It's not to say they can't rely on anybody. It's to say that culture or that attitude that they are forced to have early on shapes the culture. When you message from the left to this culture and say the general message coming from the left is, we want you to be more considerate of other people. We want you to understand that not everybody can pick themselves up by the bootstraps, and We want you to curtail your speech. These things that they say, they seem on the surface like you're telling them it's antithetical to how they grew up. This idea that, we're all in this together. Well, they didn't grow up being all in it together. They grew up, it was them, period. Do you see my point?
Yeah.
Like it's contradictory to everything that's been baked into them for a long time. So in some cases it is racism, but far less that than it is just this general attitude of, hey, I did it, you can do it. Stop complaining, stop whining about what you did or didn't get, and just do it. And again, this is not my opinion about what's right or wrong. This is just an observation about the psychological implications that map to the culture. That's kind of what I see going on. Not kind of, this is exactly what I see going on. People look at Trump and they're willing to forgive a lot of stuff because what he's saying aligns with their culture. Do it yourself, stop whining. I had to do it myself. He ties to that really well. Whereas on the left, we're all in this together. We all did this together. It takes a village, etc. Not a bad message, but antithetical to the way they grew up. So it's hard for them to shift their thinking.
Well, what I really like is the portrait you've painted here of this person who is independent and capable and a survivalist, and they're out there somewhere, maybe rural, raising chickens, and a coyote comes around. That coyote's their problem. They're not calling animal control. They're not asking for a grant to build a new fence. They're going to stay up all night with a shotgun to shoot the coyote or whatever. And I know you tied in racism to this. I see what you're saying, where if you're brought up in a way that could be a seed of it. But if you take that hint of racism out, I think what you've described is a portrait of a very reasonable person. Not me, but a person I can relate to, a person equally as American as me, and all of that. And then, having a grasp at that mindset right now, given that we've kind of delved into it, ask that person something like, hey, we want to raise your taxes now to give money to people who can't find jobs.
Right.
I can almost kind of feel how they'll react, and it's a reasonable reaction of a person who's a genuine person to me.
That is exactly what I'm saying. It is a reasonable reaction to the messaging that is coming out from the left about the right. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, because there are problems that need to be addressed. But if you're sitting there baling hay all day, every day, and you're in the middle of nowhere, the messaging of we're going to take from you to give to someone else is a tough one to swallow.
Yeah.
And it's not just that. It's more than that.
Yeah, that's one little piece of it.
We talk about first principles. What is the core thing that begins, or that is at the foundation of understanding of something? Do you have any good examples of a first principle?
Geometry, where you start from the basic axioms. There is a point. A line is the shortest distance between 2 points.
Right. Those are truths, right? That are foundational to everything else. I believe that a lot of what I'm talking about is a truth of this culture that you have to go to first before talking about racism, before talking about, all of these other things, because at the foundation, you have to discuss this first, this attitude that's built into the culture through the psychology of being forced to do something a particular way.
I honestly think we need to acknowledge it comes from a reasonable place.
Right. Because the people I know, they're not racist. Like all the country people I know. I mean, if they were, some of them are my family. So for me, this is, when I see these messages, if you vote for Trump, you're racist. It angers me because I'm like, okay, so I have to disavow my whole family because I'm a mixed family. My wife's black. My kids are mixed. Basically what you're saying is that my whole family, not my whole family, but the people who I know voted for him are racist. It's so wrong.
It's a shorthand that I think is, in part, one of the reasons why I think Donald Trump will get reelected.
I agree.
It's been miserable having him in office. And I'm not talking about politics at all. I'm talking about my friends and family who have Trump rabies. You mention his name and it's like their muscles seize up and they start foaming at the mouth. And he's a criminal. And like, if he's so bad, can't we just articulate the 3 bullets and be done with it? People have lost good rhetoric and the ability to be articulate about the points. There's just such a dislike, which I can relate to. I think he's a personally distasteful sort of guy, but we kind of got to let that one go and just talk about the issues if we're going to change anybody's mind. And I don't think there's a good messaging, that's going to get through to any potentially open minds out there. There's just this rampant dislike for the man.
Yes, agreed. And I think it happens right now. It's happening a little bit more towards Trump. Well, a lot more towards Trump. But the right has a bit of a problem with that in general on the left, not at Biden, but
Mm-hmm.
in this general attitude that the left is out to devour them and their way of life. That's not necessarily true. Like, there's a scare tactic happening on both sides. So when people are say Trump lies and this, that, and the other, and he's exaggerating and he's
Brad, listen, he needs to do what he's got to do to drain the swamp.
yeah, like a point people who used to run all the big banks, right? That's drain the swamp. Woo! That was an opinion. But yeah, I think we're deluding ourselves when we act like it's not happening on both sides. And then, it skews to one side or the other in terms of the exaggerations and lies and doing whatever it takes to win a vote. It skews,
Mm-hmm.
over in cycles. I think we all need to face facts. People are trying to get reelected. Biden's been in office 47 years of some form. He wants to get reelected. I do think he's a decent human being. I think he's probably a much better human being than Trump. But everybody gets caught up in the machine, and we have to try to be unbiased about these things and to look at face value what people are saying and what they're doing, and also give them 24 hours to clarify, right? You can't wait. You can't let someone finish a sentence and then jump on it.
Yeah.
And say, oh, you said this. I mean, okay, it's the English
Yeah.
language and it's a human. Give them a moment to clarify on both sides.